Dan Love was the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, that BLM. That's 9 years ago when BLM meant the Bureau of Land Management instead of Black Lives Matter. But that BLM guy, Dan Love, that was his jurisdiction. And he was pushing things toward a Waco, toward a Ruby Ridge or something like that. It's one of the reasons why I went there. And there was his equivalent in Arizona, Larry Wooten, blew the whistle on it. And I remember when he released this stuff in 2017, it was a big deal. He gave it to Representative Matt Shea, who exposed this. It got people acquitted because, of course, in this crooked justice system that we have, exculpatory evidence was denied. They were not allowed to talk about very trivial things. As a matter of fact, they tried to weaponize this one picture of a guy laying down in the overpass above us, and he was pointing a rifle through gaps in the concrete barriers on the side. And they said, who's he pointing the rifle at? Well, he's got the rifle pointed down there to the BLM agents who showed up in full battle gear and armor and all that were pointing weapons at us and threatening us. Go back or we're going to shoot you. The people were down in the wash area. But they weren't allowed to answer that. The defense lawyer said, who's he pointing that weapon at and why? Wasn't allowed to say that. Wasn't allowed to point out that in that picture right next to him, there is a woman who is crouching down on concrete barriers. She's not, just hiding from somebody out there who was pointing a weapon at him, right? So that was not allowed. They were not allowed to talk about any of the actions of the BLM. They were not allowed to talk about, and this is what they do. They rule out any exculpatory evidence. It's such a kangaroo court, and it's not just for January the 6th, folks. This has been going on for a long time. This is one of the reasons why it really made me angry to see what Darren Beatty and Tucker Carlson and Alex and all these other people, Steve Bannon, were doing with the Ray Epps thing. And I'll talk about that in a minute, too. There's been an update with that. Don't we have a crooked enough system? Aren't they coming after more people than are warranted and giving them bigger sentences than are warranted already? Do we have to cheer that on? Seriously? So they were prevented from talking about that. But in 2017, again, the trials are still going. First group of people have already been convicted. I have to go back and do a follow-up and see if they ever got their convictions overturned. But basically, it caused the judge to dismiss this all with prejudice, saying you can't come back and do this again. Usually if there's a hung jury or something like that, they can come back 3 times at you. This judge dismissed it and did it with prejudice, saying, this is so rigged, you're not going to come back and do this again. And so that was based on what Larry Wooten had released in 2017. He sent an 18-page whistleblower document to Washington State Representative Matt Shea, and then the mainstream media later on focused on Matt Shea and drove him out of politics, I believe. I don't think he's in it anymore. He quit at one point in time. I don't know if he's gotten back in or not. I haven't talked to him in a long time. Quote, a widespread pattern of bad judgment, lack of discipline, incredible bias, unprofessionalism, and misconduct, as well as likely policy, ethical, legal violations among senior and supervisory staff at the BLM's Office of Law Enforcement and Security. And in that, I'm paraphrasing now, I'm not reading from the document here, but I remember what Larry Wooten was essentially pointing out in terms of the conduct of Dan Love. He said, this is absolutely insane. I mean, this guy wanted a conflict, and he was doing everything he could to militarize it, to escalate it, and all the rest of this stuff. This document directly led to the dismissal of the case against Cliven and Ammon Bundy and several people involved with the 2014 quote-unquote standoff because BLM and FBI agents, quote, shredded documents at dispatch, unquote, withheld, quote, texts and emails that made officers look unprofessional, unquote, and omitted evidence during the trial that proved the innocence of the Bundy family and their supporters, you see. Typical pattern. Wooten accused Dan Love, the former special agent in charge of the cattle roundup for the BLM, accused him of intentionally ignoring direction from the U.S. Attorney's Office and his superiors in order to command the most intrusive, oppressive, large-scale, and militaristic trespass cattle impound possible. Wooten said he learned from other agency supervisors that Love had a kill book as a trophy, in which he essentially bragged about getting 3 individuals in Utah to commit suicide. This came after a joint FBI-BLM investigation. Wow. But guess what? This guy who also referred to the Bundys as retards, rednecks, tractor face, idiots, inbred, etc. No, they're not. He sent photographs of his own feces and his girlfriend's private parts to coworkers and subordinates. That Dan Love. Well, Dan Love has now been promoted by our corrupt government, and Larry Wooten, who was his peer in another jurisdiction and blew the whistle on all this stuff, is now former. That's what happens. We saw this happening throughout the lockdown. You would have people, law enforcement agents, who would say, police officers, sheriff's deputies in many jurisdictions would do social media things and say, I took an oath to the Constitution. I'm not going to arrest or attack people for not wearing a mask. Boom, they're gone. This is what happens. The corrupt organization vomits out anything that is going to push back and show their darkness. Now, thanks to recently released FOIA requests, originally made by Larry Klayman of Freedom Watch, 252 new pages of Wooten's whistleblowing evidence and testimony are now public. And the contents of this document are damning, says the Idaho Tribune that did this article. The document, which is being called Wooten 2, expands on allegations made in his original 18-page memo. The original was 18 pages. This is now 252 pages. It details the tactics used not only against the Bundy Ranch protesters, but also outlines the ongoing warrantless military-style surveillance operations and social media misinformation campaigns being conducted by the federal government against U.S. citizens. You want to know why I'm a marked man? And I don't care. I would do it all again. No regrets whatsoever. Not any. These never-before publicized surveillance operations are detailed on page 120 of the new Wooten document. Do your worst, guys. Do your worst. I don't fear you at all. I despise what you do. Absolutely despise it. And I will oppose you with every ounce of my body. Former Special Agent Wooten details the events leading up to the April 14th. It's a vast, aggressive, militaristic trespass cattle impound operation led by Dan Love. That's his words. Yeah, he's as upset about this stuff as I am. But of course, good guys like that get pushed out. You want to obey the law, the Constitution? We don't want people like you around. No. Wooten goes on to discuss an extensive social media BLM misinformation campaign that seems to have the effect of aggravating public sentiment. The misinformation campaign, he said, was similar to a military operation, an intelligence gathering operation, and was in regard to constitutionally protected First Amendment activities and akin to the intelligence preparation on the battlefield. Remember, this is back in 2014, of course. We've become accustomed to talking about this on a regular basis now. But one of the other things that Wooten had said at the time, he said, do you realize, when we started out as BLM, he said, the most that any of the agents would have is a sidearm pistol or something. He said, now, full militarized stuff, SWAT teams. The FBI couldn't specifically participate in intelligence gathering activities, he said, but I remember after the 2014 trespass cattle impound, but before the arrest operation, this intelligence gathering, generally over social media, using undercover accounts and open monitoring, was directed by Special Agent Dan Love. and conducted by a newly formed BLM unit called the Threat Mitigation Unit, the TMU. Do these things. Commanded again by former BLM Special Agent Dan Love. This activity, which was evidently prohibited by FBI policy, was allowed and conducted in the absence of specific BLM policy, in essence, by using a directed loophole to conduct the electronic surveillance and monitoring. They'll do any kind of, prevarication, loophole, faux justification for any of this kind of stuff. And so here we have the FBI, the BLM, doing what they do best, acting like criminals. Stasi. In the wake of the Bundy Ranch standoff, instead of getting demoted for going against the interagency threat assessment that clearly showed the Bundy family was not a threat, Special Agent in charge, Dan Love, got a promotion. Yeah. In June 2016, says Wooten, the BLM stood up the threat mitigation unit. In other words, they created it. Hey, stop and think about this. A threat mitigation unit? What is the mission, supposedly, of the Bureau of Land Management? Well, it's supposed to manage federal lands. Federal lands, by the way, are a constitutional oxymoron. The federal government under the Constitution doesn't have any authority to own anything. That's why they created the District of Columbia, carved it out. That and various forts and ports. End of story. And that was the key underlying thing that was also very important about this from the very beginning. I got involved because you could see this was being ramped up into a standoff, and I wanted to get as much publicity on it as possible to head that off. And, but there was also an underlying constitutional issue that was very important. There was also underlying that a very important Agenda 21 issue, which we've now seen relabeled as, the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainability, all that stuff. That was all part of that. We got to get all these people off the land. And then we'll be able to exploit all the mineral resources and everything else on there for ourselves and do whatever we want to do. He was the last remaining farmer. And this was happening. I mean, we see this happening now in a big, big way, in everybody's face, no denying it, in the Netherlands, but this is being done quietly to people out in the desert. And nobody was talking about it. And there had been, at one point in time, over 50 ranchers out there. He was the last one left. And so that's a big part of it, too. The Agenda 21 thing, the constitutional thing, and then the Waco thing. So they've got a threat mitigation unit. It's just amazing. In response to a rise in threats against public land employees and their resources, you see, it all belongs to them. We see that here even in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. I don't know if it's still going to be the most frequently visited park because they have come up with a way now to charge people. There's public roads that run through that, so they can't force you to pay to drive through the park. But if you just pull over to the side and look at the flowing river or something like that, or the vista in the mountains, you better have a pass that you paid for, because this is our land. And we got 99% of it off limits to you. And if you want to just stop and look at some of the stuff, you better pay us. It's our land, our resources. They take it personally, don't they? So, again, the threat management unit, they put in the guy who did such an awful job of it. The losing general of the Battle of Bunkerville was tapped to oversee security for the U.S. Bureau of Land Management facilities nationwide. Promoted for that. A special agent in charge of Nevada and Utah. Dan Love made decisions about law enforcement tactics and security during the BLM's standoff. And he was a guy who, since he's in charge of all this, he was a guy who had the genius idea that they would go out in the middle of the desert. And it's truly amazing when you look at Nevada, how much of that, I'm not Nevada, but Nevada, how much of that, almost said Utah, but how much of Nevada is owned by the federal government. and just how big Clark County is. Clark County is where Las Vegas is. And it's like 99.99999% of the people live in Las Vegas. But up there where the Bundy Ranch was, we'd have to travel, I forget what it was, but it was like hour and a half or something like that to get up there. Still in the same county. And there was absolutely nothing anywhere. If you've ever been to Las Vegas, you know there's nothing anywhere around there except for the city. You know, there's a few little settlements, teeny tiny things. But where they were way out, away from any other settlements. And Dan Love had the great idea of going out there and putting up a little fence in area and paid somebody to print up a sign that said free speech area. I remember that. That even got I think he's a Democrat governor of Nevada. Even he said, this is because that made the news and everybody was, what is this about? And somebody put up a handwritten sign there when we got there. It was there. Free speech is not an area. But, you know, it is an area at the Democrat and Republican conventions. If you want to go there, you can go there and you can speak and you can protest, but you will do it in a cage, literally. A cage that'll be many, many blocks away, out of eyesight, out of earshot of anybody who's having their thing. It's a perfect metaphor for what they want to do to everybody, everywhere, on the digital public square and everything else. Oh, you're still there. Well, I'm kind of shadow banned. You know, you kind of move me way out here where nobody can see or hear me. Because that's what Republicans and Democrats and federal bureaucracies do, isn't it? Free speech area. Wooten says in his document that he was concerned about BLM mission creep. I was concerned about the creeps who are on a mission, too. These intelligence-type gathering activities were evidently controversial enough to be prohibited by other agencies, to include the FBI and the BLM, operating outside of any approved policy on these activities, he said. As it turns out, Wooten was right. Not long after the formation of the Threat Mitigation Unit, the BLM in Idaho began, quote, monitoring jail calls between defendants and their wives without prosecutor or FBI consent for the apparent purpose of making fun of post-arrest telephone calls between Idaho defendants and FBI targets. You see, he's not just a petty tyrant. He's a juvenile petty tyrant. Dan Love is. Dan Love. Wooten's document continues talking about how a BLM ASAC, I don't know what that is, described to me what amounted to a parabolic microphone, covert spy listening device, and a bionic ear booster and an amplifier. In other words, listening that way instead of doing a wiretap. And we've all seen that type of thing. You see that on the sidelines of the NFL. Well, I'm not going to talk any more about that now. We got a lot of stuff to cover. I could spend an entire program talking about this stuff. The common man. They created Common Core to dumb down our children. They created Common Pass to track and control us. Their Commons Project to make sure the commoners own nothing. And the communist future. They see the common man as simple, unsophisticated, ordinary. But each of us has worth and dignity, created in the image of God. That is what we have in common. That is what they want to take away. Their most powerful weapons are isolation, deception, intimidation. They desire to know everything about us while they hide everything from us. It's time to turn that around and expose what they want to hide. Please share the information and links you'll find at thedavidknightshow.com. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing. If you can't support us financially, please keep us in your prayers. thedavidknightshow.com.